But the first meme tonight is, if someone is telling you about Jesus, they must really love you. How many of you have had somebody come up and give you a tract or witness to you? Any of you? You have, Tony? Okay. And Sherry has, yeah. I haven't. The best I could say that I had was when I went in the Army and I was on the station in a detachment or a base in Germany, and the second lieutenant, when I went to convert, you go to him and you give him money and he converts it to the mark, the German money. He invited me to a Bible study. That's the closest I came to somebody ever witnessing my whole life. And some people, I'm sure, go their whole life and nobody ever shares a gospel witness to them or anything. And it's kind of scary and sad when you think about it. But I think this is true. If someone is telling you about Jesus, they must really love you, right? That means they care about you. That's why they're doing it. And, and I love this verse. In fact, I've been looking at this verse over and over and over again. I finally took it, printed it out in my printer, and I stuck it up on my desk, this verse. I like it. Love this verse. 1 John 4:18. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment. He that fears is not made perfect in love. And if you're like me and most people, we don't like controversy, right? I mean, you don't like to have conflicts with people. So we're all kind of like, we try to prevent that kind of conflicts. And sometimes given a tract, you think, oh, they're not going to like it, they're going to come down on me. But really, very seldom does anybody ever get mad at you by giving them a tract or even inviting them to church or talking to them. But there are some out there that will, so it happens. But this verse here, it says, there's no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment. He that fears is not made perfect in love. That's a verse to contemplate, lay in bed and think about. Seriously. Fear is not equal to love. That's what it first says, right? If you love somebody, you're not going to have that fear. So there's no fear in love. And that word fear there is phobia, where, you know what a phobia is, right? It's where you're scared of something bothers you. That's where we get that word. It's the Greek word. I don't know how to say it in Greek, but it's basically our word phobia. And that word love is agape. There's different types of words for love or friendship and so on in the Bible. Agape is the strongest love, that you really love and care for somebody, and it makes it personal. But fear does not equal love. If you love somebody, you're going to do anything for them. And so the next one here, perfect love cancels fear. Notice it says there, perfect love casts out fear. So if you have perfect love, now what does perfect love mean? It means complete love. It's basically, the word there means mature, okay? Mature love. If you grow in your love for somebody, or you're growing your life with love, your mature love is going to have less and less fear for these things. So perfect love casts out fear. Like a mother will do anything for their child, right? They're not going to fear, but it's because they love that child, they'll do anything for them. And really, that's the way we should be as Christians for other people. Have that type of love and not be in fear. So then the third one here is fear equals torment. Isn't that interesting? Fear, phobia, equals torment. Now that word torment is used only 2 times in the New Testament. Did you know that? 2 times. And it means punishment. The other place that word is used is in Matthew 25:46. Matthew 25:46 says, these shall go away into everlasting punishment. Punishment is the word for torments. So fear equals torment, and it's used in 25:46 referring to eternal torment in hell. And these shall go away into everlasting torment, everlasting punishment. Okay, so it's only used twice. I thought that was interesting. Whereas the word love is used 117 times, and it's either translated as love or charity. There's a couple other times it's translated as other words, but it's usually the same. So then the fourth one here is fear does not equal perfect love, right? I mean, it doesn't. If you have not matured in love, if you still have a fear of certain things, and that's something I think we fight all the time as Christians. We all have different personalities, right? We all have different types of fears. There's other people that don't have that problem. There's more people, different people are more outgoing. Other people are shyer and quieter. But you know what? Perfect love casts out fear, does not equal to fear there. So that's the meme I have, but I also have this on here. Faith enables us to obey when obedience is costly or seems unreasonable to the natural mind. Our natural mind thinks a certain way, doesn't it? But when you say, God, I know you want me to obey you, you want me to do this, I'm going to go by faith. And I do that many times because when I'll run into somebody in a store or interact with them, I will say, you know what? I may never see this person again. Nobody may ever talk to this person again. This may be the only opportunity for this person to hear anything about Christ. So I'll give them a tract and I'll say this explains how to go to heaven and get a chance to read this tract. And so, because it's true, there's nobody out there passing out tracts or witnessing to people. They just aren't. So have faith, not fear. That's something that God tells us. We should cast out fear and have faith. Okay, so that's my meme. Now, for prophecy update, I think I will be talking about Israel quite a bit in the future here because I think everything revolves around Israel, and we see this right now, what's going on over there. But Psalm 17:8 tells me, keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings. Now, interestingly, that we talked about Ruth, and Boaz commented on her that she would come to be under the wings of, the nation of Israel there, under God. But here, keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings. And there's another verse that talks about how if you hurt God's people, it's like poking God's eye, the pupil of his eye. That's what the metaphor for the apple of God's eye. So we see here, Zechariah 2:8, for this says the Lord of hosts, after the glory he has sent me unto the nations which spoiled you, for he that touches you touches the apple of his eye. And so I don't think we'd want to touch God, the apple of God's eye. I mean, that's what's called an anthropomorphism, showing God to have attributes like mankind, which God's spirit, as you know. But still, that's the point. If we turn against Israel, we may do things against Israel, and it scares me. It scares me where our country's going because the present administration right now is not pro-Israel. They're anti-Israel, although they go through the motions. Right now we're supporting Israel. We say that we'll defend Israel. That probably won't happen in the future, especially when the next party comes in, if it's the same party that's in there now, because they're more and more anti-Israel. But it's a scary thing to think about that any government would go against Israel. There's, in the history, if you look at, there's like 4 different nations that went against Israel and they don't exist anymore. And I talked about this earlier, maybe a couple of years ago about this, but it's true. So Zechariah 14, verse 1 and 2 says this, behold, the day of the Lord comes, and your spoil shall be divided in the midst of you. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So prophecy in the Old Testament, New Testament, says Israel is not going to be a popular nation in the end times. Everybody's going to be against them. Everybody's going to hate them. And so you wonder, why could this be? Why would people hate a little country the size of New Jersey? Well, it's because it's satanically inspired, right? Because Satan and demons hate Israel because Israel brought us the Bible. They brought us the Savior. They're God's chosen people. People don't want to see that. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to think about that. And so Genesis 12:3 is still true. I will bless those that bless you. I'll curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Israel is God's people. And if we do things to curse against him and go against him, we're going to struggle. And so I don't think it's good for America if we go in that direction, because I can see where we could have some problems here in the future. And I don't want to say what it will be, but I tell you it could be scary, truthfully, if our nation, our government does not support Israel here in the future. And we know that it won't. We know that in the future that all nations are going to go against Israel. The Bible says that. Okay, so that's what I have for my prophecy update. Next, I have an apologetic, and this is from Without a Doubt by Bruce Malone, and this is about fossils. This is kind of interesting because fossils don't automatically be made when somebody dies, or a bird dies, or an animal, because their carcass lays on the ground and they get pecked away and their bones get scattered all over. Fossils have to be made by being enmeshed or endwarfed in wood, basically dirt, ground, and so on. So we'll learn about that here in just a second.
Off the coast of Australia in 2001, there was the carcass of a dead whale floating. Now, this carcass stayed there for days to the point it became a tourist attraction. And people would take their boat out, climb on top of the whale, jumping up and down on the blubber, while sharks were swimming around eating at the whale. Now, obviously, this became somewhat of a threat to life. So the municipal authorities, they hired the bomb squad of the police department to come out and sink the carcass. They planted 3 bombs inside of the stomach of that whale, cleared everybody out, blew 3 holes in the side of the whale, hoping to sink it. Guess what? The whale just kept on floating. Now, the point is, when mammals die, they do not sink to the bottom of a lake or an ocean and start to turn into a fossil. They float and then they float, as they fill with decomposing gases. And even when you blow holes in the side of them, they still don't sink. Yet the world is filled with fossils, millions, if not trillions of dead animals, like this trilobite, and 95% of all fossils are sea creatures, have been buried and every molecule of their body has changed from carbon and complex chemicals into solid rock. Now, did all these animals come to be as a result of dead, bloated, floating whale tourist attraction type events? Were they slowly covered over time as they eventually sank? No, to make a fossil, you have to bury something really fast, or it's just tore apart by scavengers. You have to bury it really deep. You have to have minerals percolating through the sediment that the animals are buried in, replacing their body with minerals, and you have to keep oxygen away. What event on Earth buried things fast, deep, kept oxygen away, and filled water with sediment and minerals? The flood of Noah, creating fossils by the trillions. See, the things we see happening today don't make fossils. The things the Bible told us about, Noah's flood, is why fossils exist, not millions of years and slow processes.
You were? Okay. Interestingly. Okay. The book of Ruth. We are in chapter 4. And next week, I think I'm going to finish the book of Ruth. We'll be talking about the child and the genealogy. And I may have 1 or 2 other topics for the next 2 weeks after that. But so if you turn to Ruth chapter 4, we're going to cover the first 12 verses. And it says, "You can be extraordinary." I sound like Joel Osteen, don't I? So anyways, okay. Two extraordinary people are brought together here. Ruth and Boaz. It's kind of cool how God brings them together. But when it's all said and done, do you want your life to amount more to your glory or to God's glory? If you listen to a lot of preachers and churches that prosperity gospel, or where it's all about you, they'll tell you you can do this, this, and this. And it basically is to give yourself glory. Well, you know what? Your glory isn't going to last very long, does it? It's going to come and it's going to go and it's going to be gone. But God's glory, if you listen to Jehovah God, the Bible, you give God glory, He's actually going to share His glory with you, and that's going to be an eternal glory. It's going to be a lot different than you and I wanting to get our temporary glory by people looking at us because we've done something or whatever, or we achieved something. There's nothing wrong with doing stuff, achieving things, but you know what? To give God the glory for our lives is the ultimate goal of what a Christian should be. So let's look at verse 1 here in Ruth chapter 4. So Ruth chapter 4, verse 1, it says this, "Then went Boaz up to the gate, and set him down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down." So Boaz, this you remember last week where Boaz was sleeping in basically the fields by his barley, protected it, and Ruth came and laid by his feet, and then he got startled, woke up, they talked, and he says, "Stay here through the night, lay at my feet." Morning, hurry up, get home, and here I'm going to give you some barley to take home, and so on. And basically it was like they came to agreement that, hey, they were in love and they were going to get married. And so he says, okay, there's something I have to do. I have to go to meet with this other guy that has the first rights because he's a closer relative. And so that's what we're seeing here as we look at this today, Boaz at the gate. And so it says there, then went Boaz up to the gate and set him down there. Now in Hebrew culture, the gate was the place for legal transactions, okay? And so we see that throughout the Bible. The gate was the primary entrance going into the city. And then yet at this gate was also where they did their official business for the city. Legal transactions, so on. I don't know how picturing it, but they probably have benches there where people would sit at and they would decide on something or vote on something. So Boaz knew that he had to meet the guy that was the closer relative there as this guy was going out to work in the fields, and he wanted to call him over to talk to him and to present this thing which was going on with Ruth and with redeeming Naomi. So there's a couple other gates in the Bible, and I've just listed a couple of them here. When Abraham purchased a burial place for Sarah, according to Genesis 23:18, he did that at the gate in the city. Okay? And then another one, Absalom's political campaign, 2 Samuel 15, verse 2, and that's where he did his politics to get everybody on his side, Absalom. And then criminal acts were judged there, like killing somebody, murder, whatever. They did that right there at the gate too. Joshua 24 is a reference. And also anarchy ensued when this system failed. The very last verse of Judges, every man did what was right in his own eyes. But here, according to Lamentations 5:14, when they don't use this system, if we don't have a legal system to say what's right or wrong, we're going to have trouble, aren't we? And it's like the idea of people saying, hey, we need to downsize the policemen, we don't need as many police. We're going to get ourselves in trouble by doing that, aren't we? So that's what happened here according to Lamentations chapter 5, verse 14. Anarchy ensued when the system failed, when they didn't have a legal system. Okay, now the phrase that's used there where it says, ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. That sounds kind of weird, right? Boaz was sitting there, and this guy walked by, and he recognized me. He says, ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. That's actually a Hebrew idiom, okay? It's like when I would say, hey, buddy, come on, sit down here, I want to talk to you. It's basically that's how they said it. And there's a couple other cases where they use this in the Bible. I know in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 8, in 2 Kings 6:8, they use that same phrase, ho, such a one. And then 1 Samuel 21, verse 2 and 3, they used it also. So it was a Hebrew phrase or an idiom to say, hey, come sit here, I want to talk to you. So this guy, I'm not sure he knew what he was going to be asked at that point, but Boaz went and explained it to him. So that is in verse 2. So verse 2 of chapter 4 of the book of Ruth, it tells us this. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit ye down here, and they sat down. So you see here that 10 men of the elders of the city, this is like judges or city council, they had to have witnesses. They had to have those that say, hey, he really did do this. This is the contract that they made, and so on and so on. So they had these 10 men that were elders, to go through this. But then in verse 3, it tells us, it says in verse 3, and he said unto the kinsman, that's the closer relative to Naomi, he said unto the kinsman, Naomi that is come again out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land which was our brother's Elimelech's. So there was a rule that, okay, here's the way it worked. Remember the tribes went into Israel, all the different tribes, they were given their sections of land, Judah, Reuben, Simeon, and so on. Well, within that section for the tribe, each family was given a section of land. And they basically owned that section for their life. Okay, if they ever did sell it, 50 years later they got it back. And I'll talk about that here in just a second. But Naomi, that has come again out of the country of Moab, remember she left, 10 years later she comes back. She was going to sell this section of land, which was her husband's, Elimelech's. She needed money, right? I mean, she was probably desperate. And sells a parcel of land which was our brother Elimelech's. So this is what Boaz is telling this closer relative to Naomi, that she's selling this land, and he's going to say, hey, you had the first rights to redeem this land, to get it back. And I'm not going to say he had his fingers crossed that he would turn it down, but I'm sure that he was praying a lot about this. And I'm sure Ruth was praying, and so was Naomi, about this whole time. But according to Jeremiah chapter 32, and that's verses 7 through 15 basically, the land must first be offered to a relative, okay? So the relative had the opportunity to buy this land back. It was called the Law of Moses. It's talked about in Leviticus chapter 25. Specifically, Leviticus 25:25, it talks about a relative has a choice to redeem land that was sold, okay? They had the right, I'm going to redeem this land because I'm a relative and I can buy this land back. So it's talked about in Jeremiah 32. Now in Ruth chapter 4, verse 4, it says, "And I thought to advertise thee, saying, Buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of my people. If thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is none to redeem it besides thee, and I am after thee." And he said, "I will redeem it." I would think that Boaz had a lump in his throat at this time, thinking, this guy said he's going to redeem it, and that's going to mess things up for me wanting to marry Ruth, right? So he was probably a little bit shook up and nervous about that. He says there, if you will redeem it, redeem it. You have first choice for this land. I'm second behind you. Obviously the guy knew that Boaz wanted to redeem it, because why would he have came there and made this offer? And this guy says, no, I'm going to buy this land back. So, and he says, and I will redeem it. He was going to redeem it. So Boaz, was in a situation, but you got to hear what the rest of the story is, right? So in verse 5, it tells us, "Then said Boaz, what day, on the day that thou buy the field of land of Naomi, thou must buy also Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance." So, as he says there, the day you buy the field of the hand of Naomi, you must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess. That is the rest of the story, okay? So now this guy realizes, okay, it's not as simple as I thought, that I could just buy the land back. I also will have to marry the deceased son Mahlon's wife and marry her to continue the family lineage by having a child. And also Naomi, the mother-in-law. I mean, this is more of a big deal than he really wanted to pay for, I think, right? But that was part of the deal. You don't just have to buy the land. You have to marry her and have a child by her to continue the name and so on. So one thing I notice here, and some people have mentioned this, and I'm not sure this is true or not, but notice in verse 5 he says, "Thou must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess." Was he emphasizing her ethnic who she was, to try to discourage this guy? I don't know if he was or not. Some commentaries think that that's possibly why he was saying that. I don't know for sure or not. But some observations here. Primarily, the concern presented was the land. The closest relative had the opportunity to buy that land, okay? And so, now I'm not saying this is Boaz's priority. He had a different priority. And then secondarily, the carrying on of the family name. And I think Boaz, yes, he was going to carry on the family name, but I think his main thing was he was going to marry Ruth. And then because he loved her, he's going to carry on the family name, and he's going to take care of Naomi also. So a whole different idea than what I think this other guy wanted. This other guy just wanted the land. He didn't realize he'd get hooked into this also. So then thirdly, this was not all according to strict Levite law. And I'll look at that here in just a second, okay? In verse 7. There is a law that says, hey, if the husband dies, the brother has to marry the wife. He really doesn't have to, but it's discouraged if he doesn't. It's looked on very negative if he doesn't. But this wasn't true in this case, because these guys weren't brothers to Mahlon, okay, the husband of Ruth. So it wasn't like that they had to do this, but they had the choice to do it because they were relatives, okay? So in verse 6, it tells us here in verse 6, "And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself unless I mar my own inheritance, Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it. So, the closest kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself. He backed out, okay? I want the land, but I don't want the lady that comes with it, or the mother-in-law, you know? He didn't want that. Now, Jewish law, as I mentioned in Leviticus 25, in Hebrew, the way the rules was, the year of Jubilee, which is every 50th year, you get the land back. That's 7 sets of 7, okay? Every 7 years, seven sets of 7 years. And in Jewish the law, the 7th year was to be a sabbatical year where the land was to rest, okay? They were to put things in silos and keep it for that year. They never did that. And that's why they got in trouble, and that's why God had the Babylonians come in there and destroy them and haul them off to Babylon, because they didn't follow that law. And so God went 70 times 7, and 490 years they owed God. And that's why I talk about, and I'm saying 483 years were completed when Jesus rode the donkey into Israel. That was 483, but there's another 7 years, and that's the 7-year tribulation that they still owe God, okay? Before he sets up his 1,000-year millennial kingdom. But anyways, in effect, a purchase, when somebody bought some land from somebody, it was kind of like a lease, wasn't it? Because they get it back after the year Jubilee, 50 years. So they blew the ram's horn on the Day of Atonement, and they would get that land back. That's just the way it was set up in Israel, or the Hebrews had it set up that way, okay? So he says here, unless I mar my own inheritance. Mar means corrupt or ruin. So was this other kinsman married? He could have been married. He didn't want to have another wife. And he probably had his own children that was going to get his inheritance. Now if he marries Ruth and they have a child, they get the inheritance. It gets divided up. It gets very complicated. He did not want to do that. You see that there, right? Now, Boaz, as you know, was going to do that, okay? Boaz was a whole different motivation. It was called love, right? And so that's the difference here. And so he says, redeem my right to yourself. In other words, you go ahead and take my rights that I have, and you take it, and it's yours to redeem it yourself. So there's 4 Levitical laws that had to be followed redeeming land. Obviously, the first one, the kinsman redeemer, a relative, had to be a blood relative, okay, a blood relative. Now, when you read through these, think about Jesus. Think about us, and think about what he did for us, and see if you can see all these correlate to Christ and what he did for us as the church. But first of all, the kinsman redeemer had to be a blood relative, right? Don't you know that Jesus Christ became a man so that he could redeem us? He took on human flesh to become a man. He shed his blood on the cross for our sins because he loved us. You see that Boaz did that here. The kinsman redeemer had to be a blood relative. And number 2, he had to have the ability to purchase the inheritance. In other words, he had to have the money to do it. Okay, you have to. If you're going to buy the land, you're going to have the money to pay for that land. Now, Boaz had that money. He was a very wealthy person. But you think of what Jesus was a man, but he was the God-man, right? He was the second person of the Trinity. He was the Son. He had the ability to purchase us. Why? Because he was sinless. He did not sin. He was God. He died, rose again, paying the sin debt, proving it because he rose from the grave. So you think about that, that's pretty neat too. And you think about that picture in the Old Testament shows us in the New Testament what Jesus did. Okay, so that was the second one. He had to have the ability to purchase the inheritance, and Boaz did, and so did Jesus Christ. But he had to be willing to buy it back. He had to have that desire of the willing. And Boaz had that desire. Why? Because of agape, because of love. Jesus Christ bought us back. Why? Well, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Jesus Christ, God sent his Son to this world, and his Son came here, obedient to the Father, to die for our sins, so willing to buy us back, Gentiles. We were redeemed too also, right? So that's kind of neat when you see this Old Testament picture and you see it in the New Testament, what Christ did for us too. And number 4, he had to be willing to marry the wife, okay? The one redeemer, the closer one, did not want to do that, marry the wife of the deceased husband, but Boaz sure did, right? And aren't we talking about in Revelation about Jesus Christ going to heaven, marrying the bride of Christ? and having that wedding in heaven and then coming back and having that big feast. I mean, Jesus Christ, we're the bride of Christ. He is the bridesman, we're the bride. So you see how these 4 points fit in with what Jesus Christ did for us also? I mean, that's kind of a cool story when you think about this. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. The Bible is written by God, and it's written by God, and you wonder, okay, I read this story about Ruth, and most people read this story, and they don't see anything beyond a love story of a man, Boaz, loving a female, Ruth. But there's much more to this book than that. And we're going to talk about more about that next week, about the whole reason for this book of Ruth being written, and to understand it, that there's a purpose for you and I to read this book. We should get something out of it. It's not just for our own satisfaction like a Hallmark movie love story, is it? No, there's much more in here about the truth that God wants us to see and understand about, hey, what Jesus Christ did for us and how he loved us. Okay, so let's look at verse 7 and 8 of Ruth chapter 4, verse 7. Now this was the manner in former time, get that part. This was the manner in former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing for to conform all things. A man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor, and this was a testimony in Israel. Then verse 8, therefore the kinsman said unto Boaz, buy it for thee. So he drew off his shoe. So let me look at that again. Verse 7, now this was the manner in former time in Israel concerning the redeeming and concerning changing for to confirm things. A man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor, and this was a testimony in Israel. Therefore the kinsman said unto Boaz, buy it for thee. So he drew off his shoe. Okay, that was like a contract. You had to take off your shoe. So let's try this. Everybody take one of your shoes off and give it to the person next to you. Okay. That would stink. Poor Sherry. But you know, that was what they did to show a contract that, hey, I got this guy's shoe. Now this guy had to go to work. How did he go to work with one shoe and missing a shoe? I don't know how that actually worked here. But as you see that, a man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor. Okay, took it off. That was to say, hey, I agree with this contract. Okay. Then this was a testimony in Israel to show that, hey, everybody saw that. He took off his shoe. Then he says, buy it for thee. So he took off his shoe. So that was a custom that they did to show that, hey, this is a legal contract. Take off your shoe. Now I wonder, did he keep this shoe and set it up on a mantle in his house, or did he have a little shelf for it? I don't know. It's kind of weird when you think about it, isn't it? But it was a legal contract to take off the shoe. Now notice when I first read this in verse 7, it says, for in former times. What that is telling you is typically they did not do this anymore. Okay, this is what they did back earlier, maybe the book of Judges and so on. It says in former times. But they still did it because, hey, they probably didn't come up with a new way or a better way of doing it yet at this time. But anyways, it says here's a former custom between these people. Now, typically this was done between brothers. When a wife's husband died and there was a living brother, that brother was obligated to marry that wife. Obviously, Boaz and this other kinsman were not brothers. They weren't close relatives like that. So it wasn't the same obligation. So I want you to look at this because this is quite interesting. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 25. And we're going to read verses 5 through 10. Because when a brother died, the other brother was supposed to marry the wife and continue on with the children and so on, an inheritance, okay? So Deuteronomy chapter 25, I'm going to read verses 5 through 10. So verse 5, if brethren dwell together, and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry outside or without a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her and take her to him to wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother unto her. So the brother was really obligated. You need to bury this wife. And verse 6, and it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. In other words, it was to help carry on the family name. Then verse 7, and if the man like not to take his brother, right, in other words, he don't want to do it, he don't like his sister-in-law, It says, and if the man like not to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate unto the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up unto his brother's a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Notice it went up to the gate. And then verse 8, then the elders of his city shall call him and speak unto him. And if he stand to it and say, I like not to take her. In other words, I don't want to marry her. Verse 9, then shall his brother's wife come unto him in the presence of the elders, and loose his shoe from off his foot, and spit in his face, and shall answer and say, so shall it be done unto the man that will not build up his brother's house. Sounds pretty rough, doesn't it? Then verse 10, and his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him that hath his shoe loosed. So the brother doesn't want to marry the woman, the other girl. She spits in his face. It was kind of a disgrace not to do that. But notice, then the house of him that hath his shoe loose. So every time somebody would walk by his house and say, there's that guy that has his shoe loose. There's where the guy with the shoe loose lives. It's kind of funny or humorous, but that was what they had back in that day. And it was to help continue on with the name of the family. And if a guy didn't want to do it, he was basically, it was a disgrace not to do it. So Boaz was not a brother. Boaz did it because of love, right? So we see that here. So as we see here, that was the former custom between brothers. And as we read Deuteronomy 25, verse 5 through 10, it says there, so he's called the house of them that has his shoe loosed, okay? So that maybe became his nickname after that, I don't know. Nevertheless, Boaz had a shoe for evidence of the contract. So Boaz took a shoe, and he had that for evidence that, hey, I'm going to marry Ruth, and he gave me the permission to do it because he's the closest kinsman redeemer. Okay, so let's look at verse 9 and 10. In verse 9, okay, you got to go back to Ruth chapter 4. Ruth chapter 4, verse 9 through verse 10. And Boaz said unto the elders and unto all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's of the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren, and from the gate of his place ye are witnesses this day. I got to tell you something. I got to admit to something. And I slapped myself in the face. Okay, I told you earlier that we didn't know who Ruth was married to. It says there in verse 10, she was married to Mahlon. I read this probably a dozen times, and I never saw that. What is wrong with my brain? Do you ever do that? Do you ever read the Bible and you'll back eventually you'll see it and say, how did I miss it? That's what's amazing about God's word. Hebrews 4:12, it's a living word, it's a living book. But I saw that and I thought, this is kind of embarrassing. Because I said, we didn't know who his brother was, who she was married to. It says right there, he's married to Mahlon, right? You see that? I mean, it's kind of funny when you think about that, but you know what? God's word is amazing, and we can read it over and over again, and we'll pick up something new every time we read it. Okay, so as we read in verse 9 and 10, Boaz mentions before the witnesses that he is redeeming the family of Elimelech. He says, I'm going to redeem them. I'm going to take care of that family. Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, okay? So he's going to marry her. He fell in love with her, and vice versa. And from the gate of his place you are witnesses today. So they had the 10 people there that were going to witness this, that, okay, he agreed to do it. The other kinsman redeemer said, yes, it's okay. I give away my rights, and he gets to marry her, and he gets to buy the land. But you know what, like I mentioned earlier, we see here a lovely picture of Christ here. Boaz from the tribe of Judah, and Bethlehemite had redeemed Ruth, a Gentile woman. Jesus Christ from the tribe of Judah, a Bethlehemite, I don't know how to say Bethlehemite, that's hard to say, redeemed the Gentiles at a great cost to be his bride, and that cost was his life. Do you see how this all fits together? I mean, isn't that kind of neat when you see that? How could the book of Ruth back there thousands of years before Christ was even born show the picture of what Christ was going to do when he came to this world? It gives you a fascination for this book of Ruth. It really does. So verse 11 and 12. And we'll pick up after 12 next week. But verse 11 of Ruth chapter 4. And all the people that were in the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. The Lord make the woman that is come into thine house like Rachel and like Leah, which two did build the house of Israel, and do thou worthy in Ephratah, and be famous in Bethlehem. And let thy house be like the house of Pharez, whom Tamar bare unto Judah, of the seed which the Lord shall give thee of this young woman. Now I'm going to talk about verse 12 a little, just a second, because to me it's a little bit of a confusing verse. But the elders said here, we are witnesses. We see it, we agree. It's Boaz did the contract, he's got the shoe. Okay, so you see the declaration of blessings here. A blessing upon Ruth. That talks about Rachel and Leah. Now, who were Rachel and Leah? Well, they were Jacob's wives, right? That 12 tribes of Israel came through them. All the tribes of Israel: Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin. Okay, there's 4 more. I can't. Who are they?
Naphtali, Simeon.
Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. So that's the 12 tribes of Israel that came from Rachel and Leah. So that was basically Israel, right? Amazing. And then a blessing upon Boaz, be famous in Bethlehem. So that was the prayer. And then a blessing upon the house of Boaz, be like the house of Pharez in verse 12. Now who was that guy? Well, he was the son of Judah and Tamar. Okay? Comes in the genealogy here. Here's what's funny. Tamar was not a good person. Go back and read this yourself. And Tamar married the one older son, and he died because of the things he did was bad. Then married another son, died also because of the things that was done. The youngest son was too young for her to marry. So she was in a predicament. So what did she do? She went out and she dressed up like a harlot, and she went and she basically seduced her father and had a child by him, okay? So when I see that blessing, as you see in verse 12, house of Pharez, whom Tamar bare unto Judah, of the seed which the Lord shall give thee to this young woman. Why is that in there? The only thing I can think of is because of God's grace. That's all I can think of. To me, it's like, that sounds kind of weird to think about that if you go and read that story about Tamar and everything about her, okay? But here's Psalms 89:36. This is a messianic psalm. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as a sun before me. So as the sun's going to continue, then his seed's going to continue forever. Jesus Christ is going to be on the throne forever. He's on the throne. He's coming back. We talked about that on Sunday. But isn't it kind of neat when you see this? All back there with Ruth and Boaz, that whole story about them going to Moab and having the frustrations. The husband dies, the two daughters' husbands die, and they move back. And how this all fits together in the story is quite an incredible story when you think that the book of Ruth was written back in the day, and then we have the New Testament written and how these all fit together. To me, it just fascinates me. Now, so our lives, as I started off, I says, we can either be ordinary or extraordinary. If you see this here, Orpah, remember Orpah? We forgot all about her. She's back in Moab. She stayed in Moab. She didn't do anything wrong. She just decided to stay with her family. Ordinary, right? Wouldn't want to step out by faith, didn't want to do anything. So Orpah's forgotten about. Now, I was thinking about this. Is Orpah saved or not saved? I go 50-50 on that. I don't know. If she was actually saved or not saved, maybe I'd lean a little more to not being saved. Whereas Ruth, I think, understood the God of the Jews and accepted him as the future coming Messiah that would come through somehow. Okay, but I don't know if Orpah really did. I don't know that for sure. Maybe we'll see Orpah in heaven also. Okay. The next one, Ruth moved to Bethlehem. She did the extraordinary. Ruth didn't have to do this. She says, I'm going to take care of my mother-in-law. And so she moved with her mother-in-law 75 miles through the treacherous terrain to Bethlehem, a place where she was going to be not fit in because she was a Moabite, and yet she did it anyway. She did the extraordinary. She stepped out for God in spite of the cost. And then we see here the closest relative not to redeem the land. That was ordinary. I don't want to pay the cost. I don't want to redeem the land. I like being in my own comfortable little area, and he was ordinary. He didn't do anything special at all, did he? And so now you can look at him and say, and I know Jason and I talked about this before, that who does he represent? Does he represent like the law of Israel? Which the law of Israel just leads you to a schoolmaster of, but it doesn't save you, it doesn't redeem you, does it? But Boaz redeems you, and it came through the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And so, then the last one, Boaz chose to redeem the land and marry Ruth. That's extraordinary. He went out of, he didn't have to do this. He wasn't like he wasn't a brother at all. He did it anyways. He loved her, but he was going to take care of her. He's going to take care of Naomi. So I think this is kind of cool when you look at this. But it tells me that, hey, you can go ahead and be ordinary and fade off into the sunset, okay? Or you could be extraordinary. You could step up for God and do something that's important. So God is looking for ordinary people to be extraordinary. We can choose which direction we want to go on the road, right? Just like Orpah did, just like the one kinsman redeemer did. Or we could choose to go on the right road for God. Isaiah 6:8, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? Then said I, here am I, send me. Isaiah said, send me, Lord, use me. And that should be our attitude too. Lord, you want me to use me? Use me. I want to do the right thing. Now the truth is, going down this long road that we all have in life, right? Some of us are farther down the road than others, but we never know when we come to the end, because God may decide to take any one of us home at any one time. People, die when they're young, they die when they're older. But the truth is, the Christian life is not a sprint. Now, you know what a sprint is, right? That's where you run real fast and you wear yourself out. The Christian life is a marathon. It's where you just keep going, you just keep going, you just keep going. The sad thing is there's many people that give up on that marathon and they go back into the world and they don't want to stay strong for Christ. But I plead with myself and each of us that we stay at this road, this marathon, and we just keep going. And so we see in this book here that we're going to see the birth of the son called Obed. And Obed, through his genealogy, David and all the way up to Christ. And it's going to be it's a fascinating story. We're going to talk about that next week, okay? So we'll see the end of this. But I think I've learned a lot studying Ruth to help put this together, to understand it more and more as I learn more and more. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up for prayer request.